a decorated Marine aviator. Welcome to the King's Report.
Thanks, Richard. It's great to be here. Appreciate the time.
Yeah, well, I mean, you have a pretty exciting biography, I have to say, and I will not go through all of it, but you were deployed in the Persian Gulf, Norway, Somalia, the former Yugoslavia. You were involved in Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, and that's the inspiration for your first book, Ghosts of Baghdad, which we'll talk about. And you, in 2004, you assumed command of the Coyotes. Who are the Coyotes? I want to know.
Well, in aviation, every unit has a kind of a call sign. So in 2003, when we went to Iraq, I was with the gun runners. So every attack, in this case, attack and light attack helicopter squadron has a nickname. Then I returned to Iraq in 2004 and 2005 as a lieutenant colonel, as a commander with the Coyotes. So we deployed into the Al-Anbar province in 2004 and then again in 2005.
Okay, and then that's the basis for your book is based on your experience in Iraq. Of course, let me just show the you have a website which is ericbuer.com and Ghosts of Baghdad. Do you want to explain about the Ghosts of Baghdad?
Well, the book, it was great. It's been out for a little bit now, and we've really been happy with its exposure and sales, of course. But most importantly, it tells a story that was otherwise untold. You had an opportunity to strap into the cockpit with me, either fortunately or unfortunately, and you get to spend, in this case, 27 days and nights with myself, my co-pilot, my wingman, as we began the opening out of the war. And then the story ends 27 days later, almost as it began. But this time we were in Tikrit, Saddam Hussein's hometown, just on the far corner of the Sunni Triangle. And so you get an opportunity to see what Marines and sailors did in that time period in 2003, and it sets us up for what would go on in that war for the next several years.
I don't know if you want to get into the issue of the war in Iraq. I mean, a lot of Americans have questions about should we have occupied the country. What is your perspective on that? I mean, I know as a military person, you go where you're ordered to go. I understand that, but still, I'm sure you may have some insights.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's they're called orders for a reason. But also, we're sworn to defend the Constitution against all enemies. And people often forget now, and people love to look at history with, like they had these incredible insights. If they had those insights and they were that smart, they would have known the potential pitfalls. But this is less than 18 months after 9/11. It's hard to put ourselves back that far again, to think
Right.
about it. 20 years ago. For me, it only seems, I don't know, half that time. But it's hard to put yourself in a position and understand the context of where we were as a nation, what was going on in Afghanistan, kind of the visceral response to 9/11, and the entire country's commitment to finding a way to stop this type of terror.
Right.
Saddam Hussein was clearly a terrorist. I mean, he gassed his own people, he gassed his enemies. I mean, he was a bad, bad person. And we didn't know what we didn't know. And so his reign of terror ended. Do you leave early? Do you stay long? Do you nation build? These are great questions. These are great questions that are answered at war colleges, and people get to pontificate about their perspectives. But at the time, no one has the right answer. And at the time, you think you were doing the best you possibly can do. And I like to think that I did, and the Marines I served with did.
I mean, one issue is the so-called weapons of mass destruction. Everyone says that there were no weapons of mass destruction, but my understanding is that later on, I think like 10 years later, Iraq sold hundreds of tons of uranium to the nation of Canada. They had uranium, which is, I guess, the building block for atomic weapons, and they they sold that huge amounts to the nation of Canada. So there was something there. I mean, I mean that doesn't answer the question of how the war, how things actually happened, and that's a whole nother issue. But
well, this Saddam Hussein's first cousin, they was known as Chemical Ali, right? He ran a secret police. He fought his last battles in the southern cities of Basra as the war began to end in 2003. But he used chemical weapons against the Kurds. He'd used chemical weapons against the Iranians. Talk to the Israelis about their F-16 missions to destroy the nuclear enrichment plants of the Iraqis. The Iraqis had real sights on the local, the local street credibility they wanted to maintain in their neighborhood. And I was saying he would use threats and innuendo. He'd keep out inspectors. And so what are you expected to believe? You expected to believe, yes, I have a nuclear program, but I don't have a nuclear program. I don't have chemical weapons, but I've used chemical weapons. Either you're going to be transparent, or at some point you're not going to be trusted. And those are hard things to trust people with if they have kind of nefarious end states.
I do know that, since we've now pulled out of Afghanistan, apparently there are a lot of terrorist groups who are now training in Afghanistan and potentially planning attacks on the West. I don't know if you've heard about that, but I believe there's some pretty bad guys operating freely there.
Yeah, there were bad guys before we got there. It created a tremendous power vacuum, and it's going to be filled by bad people. Right. There's no generous, benevolent societies that fill the streets of Afghanistan to look after women and children. It's not a fear factor I'm talking about. It's not trying to raise sympathies. It's just a fact. It's just the nature of how they conduct their society. It's brutal. When they say women won't vote, they mean it. When they say hate Americans for the fact of who you are, Westerners, they mean it, and you're not going to change that. But it's fertile ground for international terrorism. It's not scare tactics. That's what they are. It's what they will do.
I think it also shows how unique Western style democracy really is in the world. The majority of nations around the world do not respect human rights. They may have language in their constitution about some of those things, but America is pretty unique. And Western nations, I guess, the Western democracies, they're kind of an anomaly in the history of the world for sure. But okay, let me. And so I want to get into. I mean, we could talk about Afghanistan and Iraq a long time, but are there any lessons that you want to share of your experience of actually fighting there in Iraq?
Well, I would just never forget those young men and women who served there. Just don't forget them. Right. They don't need anything from us except to look after them and their families when they need help. It's not hard. It's easy. It's a simple commitment to taking care of those who went and served us. That's a story that's been told throughout our history. And it's begun to erode. I've studied a lot of history. We're in a very transitional period in our country right now. Very disrespectful, very arrogant internally, I would say, and turn our backs and turn our noses away, our noses at those who served it's dangerous. It's very dangerous, and it sets a terrible precedent for anything future that folks will need.
A lot of people have spoken about psychological warfare, that our opponents want to demoralize the American people and make them ashamed of their history and view the military in a negative light. So I guess, that's one way to win a war, right? Is you demoralize the population, and then there's less support for defending your nation.
Yeah, the ideals of this country they should be apparent to every one of us. I mean, we've gotten away from teaching basic fundamentals of our history, who we are, where we are, why we're here, and we've turned towards defending our compromises, which is a very, very slippery slope. No nation is clean of anything, but we are the only nation in the world where you can have these opportunities for anyone. People walk in the door of this nation every single day, and it's the best first day of their life. And they'll never have a better day in their life. And we provide that. We collectively provide that. And so, yeah, the internalists who have their own version of what America should be, some twisted version. We hope. We can't hope anything. I guess we have to ensure that those ideas they maintain or somehow just put into perspective over a longer term.
What about the allies of the United States? I know you were fighting from the air, but the ground forces, they used interpreters who were speaking the native language in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I've read reports that it was after the Iraq War that it was hard for the interpreters to leave. Actually, they're being targeted, and of course, after we pulled out of Afghanistan, our allies are people who risked their lives to work together with the American forces. They've had a really hard time, and they're being hunted down. Do you have any comment about that?
It's tragic. It's tragic, and it goes beyond that. For words, I'll just probably hold to myself. But it's just due to geography and politics. I don't know how you can turn your back on so many who risk so much for their own country and to serve us as what we thought would be, liberators is too strong a term for me, but someone who's going to facilitate a new life for them. Mm-hmm. And to turn our back when we have common criminals that can just step across our border and make a life for themselves. And we actively stop people who would give it all for our troops, both in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's a shame.
Right. Well, before we get into the issue of Ukraine, I'm just curious about if you have any perspective about the way that we left Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. Just curious.
Oh no! It's the same vein. It's pathetic. I don't know how you could do that. I don't know how you ever expect to maintain any international credibility. Going in, they'd say, "Oh, don't worry, the Americans will eventually abandon you. They'll leave you."
Right.
And we walked right into it. It was it was unconscionable what we did. They need to be people who've done that. People who believe that. They think that's the way we support our allies. They don't need to be serving this nation. They need to go do something else. They need to find another job doing something else because they're not serving, I believe, the vast majority of the American people who believe that was, absolutely abhorrent.
Well, one more issue I want to ask you before we talk about Ukraine is the kind of education, CRT education, et cetera, in the Air Force. I don't know if that's in the Marines or not as well. Maybe it is. Do you have any comment about it? To me, it seems so confusing. And if I were a young person in the Air Force or the Marines or the Army, what is your view on that? I'm just curious.
So I've heard and I've read. I don't have a lot of primary research on it, but the Air Force does seem to be leading the way, ironically, and doing things that may be, in my perspective, fundamentally un-American. The great thing about joining the military, you come to serve a higher calling. You swear an oath to an ideal, to a constitution. You don't swear it to a chief of staff of the Air Force who has some potentially perverted version of his own reality that he wants to set on the rest of his service. It doesn't work that way. Right. Their jobs are to recruit and train and equip those young men and women. And it's the job of the Congress and the president to use them when and where at the times of their choosing. No one should be left to run amok. These people left their lives across America to find a potentially better life and to serve, which is such a very, important and impressive thing for young men and women to do. I don't think they want things crammed down their throat. I think they want to go someplace. They want to leave someplace that was potentially doing the same thing to them.
Right.
A cleaner, a simpler life that understands, we're here to serve. We're here to serve our nation. We're not here to We're not here to be politicized or push forward any of your political agendas, very short-term political agendas.
Right. Okay. All right. I just curious. All right. Let's talk about Ukraine. Okay. Well, what are the key takeaways for the U.S. military from the ongoing war in the Ukraine?
Well, I think one thing about what we are so concerned about, it's certainly a regional conflict that has global implications because it involves the alliance, it involves NATO. It also involves a bully, right? It involves another bully. This is a war of aggression. Russia has no political, they have no social, they have no moral high ground to stand on whatsoever. This is simply a war of aggression. It's a land grab. It's a population grab. Russians have a death rate, right? They have had a death rate for generations. Their population continues to decline. And so how do they maintain their regional, what they believe is their regional strengths? Well, they're going to attempt to be a bully. And Ukraine is a rich country in a lot of ways. So I think the U.S. military, I don't know how many kind of tactical or operational lessons we're learning, because we fight war differently. If you look at the Russians, their techniques coming in was to rubbleize. It's like something out of the Second World War. Heavy tubed artillery, very indiscriminate fire, rubbleizing, just destroying any places forces can hide. Back that up with some type of air component. In their case, air to ground, Su-25s, Su-27, 29s, and then some little light use of helicopters. It's a war of attrition. I don't necessarily believe the Ukrainians need to win it. I think the Russians are losing it on their own. They've culminated multiple times, right? And so it doesn't take much of a counteroffensive by the Ukrainians to force the Russians, particularly on a counteroffensive where the Ukrainians can find a time and place to make those counterattacks, make that counteroffensive. They can be over. It's a massive border they're attempting to defend, and it puts the Russians on their heels. The Russians aren't particularly well led. They're not particularly well trained. They're not particularly well equipped. Their leaderships are very centralized, and so when you're talking about the Ukrainians finding smaller maneuver units to punch holes in those defensive lines, are now counteroffensive lines in certain places by the Russians. It puts the Russians in peril. The Russians will culminate. They have to. They can't sustain this level. They've lost tens and tens of thousands. They're losing a generation of youth. I don't know how the Russian people stay immune to it. I don't think they are. But the Russians don't have that much left to give. They just don't. It's just a key for Zelensky and his team and his team of advisors to find a way simply to hold out and put as much pressure as they can on the Russians to force them to capitulate at some point, or at least that's the difficult part, right? It gets into there's so many egos involved, particularly when you're talking about Russia. How do they come to a place where they think there can be some type of negotiated settlement where they can save face?
Some people wonder if there are interests that don't want to see a ceasefire and a peace agreement. There are some people argue that some people want the war to continue, and I don't know if you have a comment about that. Just
yeah. So I know there's certainly divides within the U.S. of how and why we're supporting. It goes and it cuts straight down political lines. For the most part, I think any reasonable person looking at this would want to find a very quick, long-term, sustainable end to this conflict. The Russians have to know borders are going to be redrawn. Once those borders are redrawn and there's a ceasefire, why wouldn't the Ukrainians want to be a member of NATO? And why wouldn't they want to seal off that portion of their borders? Why wouldn't NATO want to seal off that portion of their borders? Those borders then have to be protected and patrolled. That's what you have to do with a bully, right? You got to keep counterpunching the bully till it stops. That leaves the Russians even more isolated. It leaves them isolated on their southern borders. The northern borders have been now sealed off. And so you look at their southwestern borders. You look into Belarus, what the Belarusians have done. And they're really running out of options. Again, it's not a U.S. war. It's a NATO and it's an alliance peace that puts us that close to a Russian-Ukrainian war. I think in many ways it's their negotiated settlements to settle however they want to do that. I think the U.S. should be offering leadership, should be offering advice, but eventually it's going to have to be dealing with the Ukrainians, the Russians, and the rest of NATO, and those really border states feel is going to be sufficient to prevent Russia from continued aggression.
Okay. All right. I do want to draw people back to your book again. I think it's. I love the name, by the way. Why do you call it The Ghosts of Baghdad? What is the meaning of that name?
Well, nothing scars you deeper than a good dose of horror, and that's exactly what it was for us. I mean, you have an opportunity, and in aviation, there's things that you rely on, and when they fail, oftentimes your confidence fails, and the ground beneath you kind of falls with it. And we chased a lot of ghosts out there. It was certainly a determined enemy in times. It was 50-year sandstorms. It was moonless nights, and it was the unknown. And it was all those things that make you realize you're not alone out there, and there's a lot of evil. And that's kind of the way I saw it. That's kind of the way I described it to myself. And as I spent the hundreds of hours talking to co-pilots and squadron mates and told them what I was doing, and as I interviewed them, they were in violent agreement with kind of the description of the environment we were fighting in. So the title came to me, and it stuck, and it makes sense. And as you read the book, it'll certainly make sense to you. Okay, well, I'm sure that could be ordered at any bookstore. Absolutely, yeah. Go to Amazon. It's available on Amazon. If you want to go to Ballast Books, which is my publisher, I'll ensure I sign it for you, and I'll mail it to you myself. But otherwise, any place, your favorite bookstore, you can get it. And it's available certainly on Audible. It's available on Kindle, and I think you'll enjoy it. Any future plans? I'm curious. Any other books or any future plans for you? Well, we do. I think I've started a second book called Devil in the Triangle, and it picks up in 2004. It really picks up where I left off in 2003, up in Tikrit in the Sunni Triangle in Iraq. Went from Tikrit down to Baghdad, out into the Al Anbar province, which was lovely cities of Fallujah and Ramadi. And so I'd spend the next 2 deployments there, and that's where I'll pick up Devil in the Triangle, and I'll capture the work and the amazing sacrifice of those Marines and sailors and soldiers that were fighting in the Al Anbar province. Okay, well, we look forward to that book, and thank you for coming on the King's Report, Colonel Buer. We really appreciate it. Thanks, Richard, and thanks to all your viewers and listeners. You have a great day. All right, take care. Bye-bye.